Hello, my name is Deanna. Today, my group will be discussing the death penalty. To gain an understanding of why the death penalty shall not be reinstituted, it is important to acknowledge the history of the body politic in the context of death penalty reform in Canada. The term body politic is used by Foucault to distinguish the variety of elements that support the power knowledge investment on the individual body. In his book, Discipline and Punish, he writes that the body politic is a set of material elements and techniques that serve as weapons, relays, and communication routes. I will be discussing the discourse techniques of punishment that serve as political technology in death penalty reform. Understanding what discourse means is critical in being able to conceptualize how the system of power determines what is right and wrong and governs our knowledge. Discourse is most commonly associated with communication, the verbal and textual language. Often overlooked is the symbolic forms it can take. For example, the ritual that precedes and supersedes the death penalty. The courtroom proceedings are symbolic because it represents the procedural side of punishment, and it builds a sense of public trust in the justice system. The execution is symbolic as it incites the collective consciousness of the moral view of an eye for an eye and supports the rhetoric that state sanctioned killings are acceptable. I encourage you all to think of the body of knowledge that you currently have surrounding the death penalty, and then ask yourself, where did that body of knowledge come from? Most people could probably agree that they have formed knowledge on this subject through experts who claim to have expert knowledge, people we trust and respect. In Foucault's book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, he asks, who is speaking? Is it your high school law teacher, your Sunday school teacher, or maybe your understanding of the death penalty came from the W5 episode you watched with the hosts and guests who present as experts on the topic? The politicians, the journalists, the preacher, the teacher, the doctor. Foucault calls these subjects the annunciation subjects. They are the ones responsible for the construction of the discourse that you have been subjected to. Once you identify the enunciating subjects, analyze the institution that gave them the platform. Institutions have a tendency to support a specific body of knowledge. In his book, History of Sexuality, he explains that discourse is tactical in nature. To examine it, question the tactical productivity of the speaker and their strategic integration. There is no top down absolute power reign from any one of these enunciating subjects or institutional sites. Instead, they collectively shape the discourse around the death penalty. As Foucault explains, power invests the human body in all different forms. It runs through us. In the following segment, I will be applying Foucauldian discourse theory to analyze the history of death penalty reform. To truly comprehend this theory through a Foucauldian lens, you need to, quote, orientate yourself to a conception of power which replaces the privilege of the law with the viewpoint of the objective, quote. Foucault makes the distinction between the repressive techniques of sovereign power and modern techniques of disciplinary power. I would like to start with the discussion on sovereign power. Foucault uses the word deduction to conceptualize sovereign power, as it was used to acquire things like taxes, food, labor, and wealth from subjects. Sovereign power governed during the early epochs. Sovereign power is best understood as a central power with an absolute character. During the early epochs, the death penalty was generally accepted by the public because of a desire for revenge and to protect the body politic. In this era, the sovereign was designated as a legitimate agent to punish by harming the body. It is documented that the majority of the public endorsed the death penalty because they favored conceding authority to their government to commit violence for both their enjoyment and security. Prior to Confederation, Canada was ruled under the regime of the British legal system, referred to as the Bloody Code. As recently as 1819, there were approximately 230 crimes that were deemed punishable by death. Examples of crime that would warrant the death sentence included pickpocketing goods worth a shilling, stealing sheep or horses. The primary mechanism used in the exercise of the death penalty in Canada was public hanging. According to Foucault, public executions are best understood as a theatrical ceremony used by the sovereign as a deterrence to crime and was considered necessary to maintain social order. Cultural uncertainties about the use of the death penalty started to erode because of botched executions. A shift in discourse formed a new body of knowledge that influenced the collective moral view of the public, with sympathy towards the criminal and malice view of the executioner. It was documented that there was an unwillingness on behalf of the jury to render a guilty verdict because the death penalty was viewed as too harsh of a sentence. The unpredictability of shifting social sensibilities threatened the sovereign regime of power. The Enlightenment period saw a lessening in the use of deductive power and the inception of disciplinary power. This is the power that manifests itself in the surveillance, observation, control, and optimization of the body. A power constructed around two elements. Firstly, the reliance on the use of the body in the methods of production. Foucault calls this the administration of bodies. Secondly, the emergence of bodies of knowledge that were formed on the subject of the species being, which is understood as the biology of the body. In this sense, we're talking about the techniques that achieve subjection of bodies, biopolitics, through the discourse surrounding birth, mortality, health, life expectancy, and population growth, all of which are governed by power, controlled, and regulated. The 19th century is when the rehabilitation movement began to construct its discourse. The same century when Bentham's panopticon was adopted by a majority of prisons. Confederation, 1867, there was a distinguishable change in the discourse of the death penalty because the law deemed only acts of murder, rape, and treason punishable by death and preferred to subject criminals who committed historically death-worthy crimes to terms of imprisonment. This is exemplary of the adoption of disciplinary power. A new body of knowledge had been formed regarding punishment. Gradually, the theatrical ceremony declined. A shift in social discourse was a catalyst for death penalty reform and a redistribution of responsibility in the justice system. Foucault wrote that the language surrounding the death penalty began to manifest itself in the rhetoric that quote, it is ugly to be punishable, but there is no glory in punishing. A political policy change in 1868 required executions to be held out of the view of the public inside the walls of a prison. This marks a significant shift in the symbolic discourse of the public spectacle of death. Once the iconography of the collective consciousness transitioned to the subconsciousness. Behind closed doors, no one could see or resist disciplinary power. Between 1914 and 1924, there were attempts at death penalty reform, but all were unsuccessful. The great loss of life that transpired during World War I and World War II perpetuated a labor shortage, so the idea of condemning a readily able man to death did not seem to meet the goals of society. During the period of 1867 to 1962, 710 Canadians were executed of the 1,300 Canadians sentenced to death. The scientific idea of diminished responsibility was picking up momentum. Increasingly, commutation of death sentences was granted using a method of clemency called the Crown Prerogative of Mercy, used by both the liberal and conservative regimes of power. During 1952 to 1957, the Liberal government commuted 45% of capital cases. The subsequent Conservative government increased the rate of commutations during 1958 and 1962 to 82%. The use of the Crown Prerogative of Mercy represents the gradual aversion to the responsibility of the condemned man. As Foucault wrote, quote, if it too strikes, if it too kills, it is not as a glorification of its strength, but as an element of itself that it is obliged to tolerate, that it finds difficult to account for. Quote. In the modern era, we rely heavily on expert scientific knowledge. In the 1950s, the Canadian Royal Commission published a report recommending more humane methods of execution. This is symbolic of the relationship that had formed between jurisprudence and science. the justice system began to accept expert scientific knowledge as the regime of truth by indoctrinating the use of doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, chaplains, and educationalists in the judgment process. A report in 1956 recommended the death penalty only be imposed on criminals over the age of 18 because of developments in brain science, an example of the body of knowledge that had formed on the species being. This is an example of a great transition. The formal power regime extended the authority of power to other authorities, lessening the regime's responsibility in condemning the condemned, making it more of a collective responsibility. The relationship between jurisprudence and science is representative of a shift in the focus of the criminal versus the criminal act. Because we as a society place a high value on scientific knowledge, we have created a system where we self generate our own objects of study through bodies of knowledge. Envision a revolving door of production of new knowledge, a dialectic continuum. Titles like dangerous criminal were not around in past periods of penal history like the Renaissance period. It was not until the classical period, which included the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment period, that we began to be interested in humanity as a biological thing. We started to categorize things and observe things and quantify things. Titles like dangerous criminal, sex offender, and high risk offender are all labels that experts have created that formed a new body of knowledge, that in turn created new objects of study. With that being said, in the modern era, the discourse of punishment generates objects of study through categorizing and labeling criminals. In 1960, the Bill of Civil Rights distinguished between capital and non capital crimes. This encouraged the discussion of the rational man and the degrees of culpability. In the modern penal system, particular elements of a crime are dissected and quantified to reach a judgment, where in comparison to the sovereign penal system, if you met the mere definition of the crime, you warranted the punishment. Foucault's theory of discourse defunks the idea of a rational man, which in turn refutes any argument on the use of the execution as a deterrence mechanism. Our reality is discursively constructed in the discourse we are subjected to. The way we perceive things is subjected to what form and degree of discourse we have been exposed to. Between 1965 and 1968, the Liberal government commuted all death sentences to life imprisonment by utilizing the Crown prerogative of mercy. The execution that was once symbolic of the death penalty legally shifted to that of a timetable agenda. This period is referred to as de facto abolition. Emphasis is placed on reforming the offender through a restrictive schedule with the intention of influencing their body of knowledge through the subjection of mechanisms of disciplinary power. Foucault uses the blueprints of the panopticon to explore the disciplinary techniques employed in the modern penal system. The panopticon is an institution of punishment designed in a way that an observer can observe multiple bodies at once. Not only are the lowest bodies on the hierarchy observed, but the panopticon is constructed in a fashion that breeds surveillance of subordinates by their supervisors. This is a reflection of the self-policing environment that society encourages. The panopticon is a mechanism of political technology used to subject a body to surveillance. In today's society, the panopticon has moved beyond the walls of the prison and functions as a decentralized apparatus that penetrates society with disciplinary power. In July 1976, the death penalty was abolished. Through Foucault's lens, we are produced to be happy with the laws around us. The discourse discursively produces the way we look at things and shapes our knowledge. The discourse that followed the abolition determined how we viewed knowledge, and knowledge is what determines how we view the death penalty. The official abolition solidified a change in the mechanism of punishment, from corporal death sentences to non-corporal life imprisonment. Understanding why an offender committed an act and changing the behavior of an offender through programs or the heavily relied upon psychopharmaceutical efforts is the new power knowledge perspective of the modern penal system. The abolishment of the death penalty changed sentencing. Now, a life sentence is intended to be rehabilitative, intended to correct, reclaim, cure. The intended perception is that the justice system is more humane, but behind that perception, Foucault notates the reality is there is now a lessening of responsibility that came with the heavy moral burden of punishment. Foucault writes that the change in the mechanism of punishment, quote, do not punish the same crimes or the same type of delinquent, but they each define a certain penal style, quote. One focused on the atonement of the body, while the latter, the atonement on the soul. Many topics repeatedly enter the debate on the death penalty, but it's important to acknowledge that the public endorsement for the retention of the death penalty has been linear throughout our history. Between 1979 and 1980, 29 private member bills proposing reinstatement of the death penalty had been introduced without success. Moreover, from 1980 to 1987, there were several other attempts at death penalty reform. In 1987, there was a final publicized death penalty debate in Parliament. During the debate, it was reported public support for the retention declined from 70% to 61% because statistics were presented to show Canada's murder rate had declined since capital punishment was abolished. Prime Minister Mulroney spoke after the debate that saw a motion supporting the death penalty defeated 148 to 127. He used strong words, calling the death penalty repugnant. Statements like repugnant, by what one could argue was the most powerful man in Canada at the time, are the type of statements that the public view in high regard and interpret as expert knowledge. Theoretically, it could produce a discourse that supports the abolition. This is an example of how everything is discursively produced. Nothing exists outside of discourse, and that's how the power-knowledge relationship works. The topic of the power regime's awareness of public opinion of the death penalty is interesting to note. The same phenomenon was documented in France when they abolished the death penalty in 1981. What cause does a democratic regime of power have to defy popular sentiment and nullify the death penalty law against the majority of public opinion? In democracy, should the majority not be respected? What does the elites class willingness to push a policy forward without the majority of public support say about the significance of this debate? We are left to speculate through the lens of Foucauldian theory that the power regime abolished the law to increase the level of public morality, to help further sustain the values of our society through an increase in production and knowledge. The next speaker will present the first argument on how the current death penalty policy supports the system of production.
Our first argument is abolition and its relation to the system of production. Bentham theorized that nobody benefited from the death of a criminal, whereas other types of punishment, like life imprisonment, have had positive outcomes like rehabilitation. Bentham focused on the incapability of a dead man's ability to repay society for the unrest they inflicted if they were killed. The prison system, an institution pivotal in the superstructure of society, supports the abolition of the death penalty. In both provincial and federal prison facilities in Canada, prisoners perform labor tasks as part of their rehabilitation. This labor takes two main forms: institutional maintenance, for example, cleaning and cooking, or work-like experiences, for example, construction, painting, and farming. This initiative supports Bentham's advocacy for forcing the criminal to benefit society. Quote, "The punishment of death is not convertible to profit. It cannot be applied to the purpose of compensation, in so far as compensation might be derived from the labor of the delinquent. The very source of the compensation is destroyed." End of quote. Bentham has been described as the quote, "founding father of happiness." Bentham believed that the arguments against the death penalty were superior, with one crucial reason being the main argument. Quote, "Once a criminal is killed, he is no longer capable of repaying society for the damage that he has caused." End of quote. Bentham talks about four major reasons why the death penalty is morally wrong. The reasons revolve around how the death penalty is irreversible, nobody benefits from the death of a criminal, and once a criminal is killed, there is no opportunity for that offender to repay their debt to society. Bentham believes the main goal of punishment is to bring society and those involved happiness. If the majority of society is not obtaining happiness with the rulings of punishment, then there is something wrong with that said punishment. With respect to punishment, Bentham believes punishing needs to be centered around gathering the highest degree of happiness obtainable. Quote, if the evil of punishing an offense is greater than the evil it seeks to prevent, then that kind of act is unmeet for punishment. End of quote. According to Bentham, a life served behind bars, including hard labor, occasional solitary confinement, and things of this nature, are much more impactful and a better alternative than capital punishment. Imprisonment allows for the offender to possibly please society in two ways: by means of any good work while in prison, or by means of any good work after the offender is released from prison. Neither of these options is possible when you sentence them to death. Using Karl Marx's historical materialism as a tool, we understand that production is the basis of human society existence. Capitalism is the primary mode of production, and thus we attach a high value to labor. Foucault states that the body is, quote, invested with relations of power and domination largely for economic use as a force of production. End of quote. By not reinstating the death penalty, we support the rhetoric of rehabilitation with the intended outcome of producing a productive member of society. The idea of a productive man stems from the social norm symbolic of capitalism. In the modern era of capitalism, rights like individual freedom and property rights are held in the highest regard, so transforming punishment into the quote, economy of suspended rights was the next logical evolution to the death penalty policy in the Canadian criminal justice system. In this sense, the punitive measure of a life sentence can be interpreted as not completely coercive, but also linked to positive mechanisms that support the values and norms of our capitalistic society. Much like Foucault has indicated in his work, power can be both positive and or coercive. People following order and being productive is the entire point of society, and as Foucault states, quote, the body becomes a useful force only if it's a productive body and a subjected body. Our current penal system exemplifies this through the timetable agenda that inmates are subjected to and the productivity of prison labor initiatives that benefit society. Reinstating the death penalty and executing an individual does not serve us as a collective. Remember that the means of society's existence, production through labor power, is only possible if the body is caught up in a system of subjection. The body becomes a useful force only if it is a productive body and a subjected body, not an executed body. The next speaker will present our second argument on the unjust application of the death penalty.
Karl Marx interprets the death penalty debate through the lens of class theory. The death penalty law was written by the governing elite to maintain and protect the power of the social elites from the marginalized class. The majority of the population was illiterate when the death penalty policy was introduced. Marx assumes that all human beings are good and that society corrupts them. To quote Marx, it's not that man behaves as an animal because of his nature. It is that he is not fundamentally allowed by the virtue of the social arrangements of production to do otherwise. Reinstating the death penalty law would do nothing but perpetuate class tensions between the oppressed, those that met the definition of the middle-class measuring rod, and the bourgeoisie. There is a deep-rooted relationship between the Indigenous peoples and the death penalty law. Canada has a long history of colonization, and we are all aware of the atrocities that the Indigenous populations were subjected to. Did you know that the largest mass state-sanctioned death penalty sentence in Canada was in 1885, when 8 Métis were executed by public hanging? The Prime Minister at the time made this remark: "The execution of the Indian ought to convince the red man that the white man governs." That is a powerful statement made by the regime of power, and it's symbolic of the goal of the death penalty, to let the marginalized know that their right to life is contingent on their behavior, and their behavior will be judged through the subjective eyes of the elite. Reinstating the death penalty will give the elite class the power to decide if you deserve to live or die. Power determines right and wrong, and the marginalized experience powers in ways that encourage them to usurp the power. Poverty is a key factor in crime, and the type of crime that historically has warranted the death penalty is a product of the conditions people are subjected to in a capitalist society. The Supreme Court of Canada has acknowledged the unbalanced ratio of imprisonment for Aboriginal offenders flows from a number of sources, including poverty, substance abuse, lack of education, and the lack of employment opportunities. It arises also from bias against the Aboriginal people and from an unfortunate institutional approach that is more inclined to refuse bail and impose more and longer prison terms for Aboriginal offenders. Canada's Black population is also subjected to discrimination in the Canadian criminal justice system. When Black people in Canada are incarcerated, they are more likely to face harsher treatment. Black people are more likely to be involved in incidents where officers use force, they're assessed as high risk, and they're put into solitary confinement. Black people make up 9.2% of the prison population, while only making up 3.5% of the total Canadian population. Black people who enter the criminal justice system are often met with discrimination, labeling, and racism. Parliament of Canada acknowledges that Black people are less likely to have their convictions overturned. A disproportionate number of marginalized people historically have been subjected to the death penalty. There is a disparity in sentencing between white and blue-collar crimes. Look no further than next door, the United States justice system, where if you are poor, Black, male, and ignorant, you are more likely to be sentenced to death. Currently, in the United States, Black people make up 41% of death row inmates. One man who is part of the statistic was Leo Jones. Jones was a low-level drug dealer with a prior history of criminal activity. In 1998, he was executed for the sniper-style killing of a police officer. Jones was convicted over a signed confession and one witness statement. There is substantial evidence to support Jones's innocence. Not only did more than a dozen eyewitnesses place another man, Glenn Schofield, at the scene with the crime, Schofield confessed to the crime to 5 different people and his alibi admitted to lying to officers. Jones himself was beaten by the police twice before he signed his confession, and the one witness to identify Jones recanted their story. One officer admitted to physically intervening to stop another officer's attack on Jones, and admitted he lied on the stand in order to secure his pension. Another officer boasted about the beating he inflicted on Jones before getting him to confess. It took 3 trials to convince Jones, and the judge who presided over the first 2 trials was disqualified for giving bribes. Jones's case is only one of many that's filled with corruption and coercion. Death is irreversible, and our criminal justice system is flawed. If the death penalty was reinstated in Canada, we would condemn innocent people, specifically from marginalized communities. The goal of the death penalty has never been justice, fairness, or equality. The primary function of the death penalty was social order within society. In 1868, when the government required all executions to be held out of the view of public, a notable phenomenon occurred. As Foucault wrote, the regime of power recognized that the mere certainty of punishment was enough to maintain social order. The bottom line is, throughout Canadian history, the death penalty was never administered with equality. Human progress that has brought us beyond the abolition of the death penalty should not imagine itself to stop with its reinstitution. The next speaker will present 3 arguments, citing a function to deviance, wrongful conviction, and counter-deterrence.
There will always be sinners in a society of saints, as argued by Durkheim. Durkheim believed that deviance is a natural and necessary part of society. Deviant acts that have historically warranted the death penalty will continue to happen as they have since the beginning of time. The reality is we do not live in a utopia, but by imprisoning offenders for life, we as a society are able to distinguish between good and evil acts, and we need to maintain the iconography of the collective consciousness to uphold and protect the social cohesion of society. By not supporting the reinstitution of the death penalty, we support the unified front reflective of organic solidarity that sends the message that killing by an individual or by the state is not tolerated, and offenders will be held accountable and punished by the means of a life sentence. My second point is on wrongful convictions. Wrongful convictions are a significant factor as to why the laws surrounding the death penalty should remain as is. One of the major reasonings for why Betham was against the capital punishment was because capital punishment is irremissible. As Betham wrote, quote, "For death there is no remedy," end quote. There is no way to correct capital punishment once the act is done. In the case of wrongful convictions, imprisonment allows for a reason to adjust and alter prison sentencing. But if you sentence an innocent person to death before there is enough reason to acquit them, the innocent person is killed by the state and there is no chance of correcting that error. Betham critiqued the criminal justice system for commonly making errors. Some of those errors are that judges are prone to making mistakes, witnesses disposing falsehoods, factors of circumstantial evidence, and unmotivated sudden actions. Former presidential candidate Reverend Jesse Jackson was of the same belief as Betham. Jackson believed that the state was prone to allowing retaliation, committing inaccurate sentencing, meeting of higher ethics, and ultimately abolishing the death penalty. Quote, "Nobody has the right to kill anybody, and we need to break the cycle of killing," end quote. According to Innocence Canada, 24 innocent people who have been exonerated since 1993. Innocence Canada is a nonprofit organization which advocates and works to exonerate those who have been wrongfully convicted. Currently, there are 90 cases under review across Canada, 15 of which are being examined by the board of directors at Innocence Canada. Knowing these statistics, it is important to note that approximately 4% of those on death row are presumed to be innocent. That means if the death penalty were to be legalized, 1 in every 25 people on death row would be murdered for a crime that they did not commit. While wrongful conviction can affect anyone, there are a variety of factors that contribute to the likelihood of someone becoming wrongfully convicted. The 5 main factors are as follows: racial biases, tunnel vision, youth vulnerability, jailhouse informants, and prosecutorial ethics. Additionally, the errors surrounding eyewitness testimony consist of around 70% of wrongful convictions that result in DNA exonerations. Wrongful convictions undermine the legitimacy of the criminal justice system, resulting in social uproar and building of distrust, which threatens the regime of power. My third argument is on the topic of deterrence. Throughout the debate of the death penalty, the concept of the death penalty as a catalyst for deterrence is argued. In his book, Rationale of Power, Betham discusses deterrence as a relevant argument for the retaining of the death penalty, citing creating safer societies and supporting the moral consciousness of right and wrong. The essence of the deterrence theory is that the threat of execution should lessen the likelihood of someone committing an act and thus protecting society. Overwhelmingly, academic studies have been inconclusive and cannot state that the death penalty is a deterrent. In most recent statistics from Statistics Canada indicate that in 1975, the year before abolition, the homicide rates per 100,000 population was 3.02, and in 2021, the rates were 2.06, thus representing the decline in murder rates since the death penalty has been abolished. In 1853, Marx wrote an article on the death penalty, citing its counter-deterrent and brutalization effect. The brutalization theory hypothesis states that the death penalty decreases the respect for life, inflaming homicidal violence within a society. One study in Oklahoma compared homicide rates around the state, execution dates, and found that Oklahoma experienced a significant increase in killings that involved strangers. If Foucault theorizes that there is no rational man, we are all primitive beings with thoughts that originate in unconscious needs or desires and are unaffected by objective reasoning, that there is no such thing is an objective human and all our decisions are based on our environment, then what basis does deterrence have in this argument?
At the beginning of the debate, I made a distinction between sovereign power and disciplinary power. During the epochs of sovereign power, the regime had the right to impose death on the body. During the periods that followed, notably the 17th century, the inception of multiple forms of power began to be developed through the channels of scientific discourse. Foucault identified the 17th century as a turning point in the government's role in imposing death. He distinguished a shift of discourse from the power of death to the power of life. Earlier in the debate, I identified two elements that attributed to the right to life. Firstly, the indispensable function of the body as a machine of production. Secondly, the development of different bodies of knowledge that formed around the species being. These two elements combined represent a power that is no longer interested in just applying power in the legal context, but instead interested in producing life and the salvation of society. Foucault wrote that, quote, as soon as power gave itself the function of administering life, its reason for being, and the logic of its exercise, it made it more and more difficult to apply the death penalty. How could power exercise its highest prerogative by putting people to death when its main role was to ensure, sustain, and multiply life? Quote. In 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted. Section 12 protects against any cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. Section 7 reads, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security. These rights are symbolic of the discourse that supports the collective norms and beliefs of society. The abolition of the death penalty was the last remaining evidence of the old power of death that symbolized sovereign power. We believe the government should not have the right to impose death because it's a contradiction to capitalism and science. This debate considered the arguments against reinstating the death penalty. We presented 5 arguments. Firstly, through Bentham's utilitarian theory, we presented an argument that supported abolition as a function of production. We stated that the death penalty is not a productive response in today's society. We then presented a Marxism argument on the historically unjust discrimination in the application of the death penalty on the working class. We stated the death penalty is applied unfairly and should not be used. Moreover, we used Durkheim to explain that we need offenders in jail to serve as an iconography of right and wrong. We then used Bentham's work to advocate for the risk of wrongful convictions, stating the risk of executing an innocent person supersedes the use of the death penalty. Furthermore, we presented a counter-deterrence and brutalization argument to state that the death penalty is not proven to deter future murders. Thank you for listening to our debate.